Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah and I spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that really exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights and our experience and our knowledge in the hopes of inspiring leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
We're wrapping up our third season, and today we've decided to focus on a category of safety that isn't often named or even really talked about. Kind of feeling safe to do the right thing and feeling safe that other people will do the right thing. And we call it moral safety.
And it's not really a subject that is easily discussed or described. So we're going to take a crack at it. Several decades of research has demonstrated that the course of childhood and adolescent and adult development really can be radically derailed as a result of exposure to trauma and adversity in a myriad of ways. And this derailment often presents as very complex physical and psychological and social and moral challenges. These are all interdependent and interactive challenges, and they require high levels of emotional, social, and moral intelligence on the part of the people involved, including the helpers.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about moral safety, it helps to kind of think about what moral intelligence is. And that refers to an individual's mental capacity to determine how universal human principles should be applied to their personal values, their goals, and their actions. Moral intelligence serves as sort of the central kind of intelligence for all human beings that bind the individual to their social group, their culture, and their moral system. And it allows us to define how to use other forms of intelligence. And it directs us towards the things that are worthwhile, kind of functions to give our lives purpose and meaning.
Yeah, that a fundamental sense of I know what the purpose of my life is. It's when things are going well, it's just kind of there. It's kind of at the substrate of our existence. But the shattering nature of traumatic experience can undermine and sabotage that development of moral intelligence, and that can have profound effects on the person and the groups of which the person is involved. We can see all around us the signs of this moral derailment, almost as a characteristic sign of our culture at present: violence and corruption, insensitivity and empathic failure to outright abuse, ignorance and just incredible stupidity, silence and secrecy, authoritarianism and autocracy, injustice and narcissism, and then repetition and a stagnation that's kind of everywhere. And what's symptomatic of that in the most profound and terrible way is so many children who are hungry, homeless, and hopeless.
Yeah, I think about how in this moment in our cultural experience, there's sort of this wistfulness for the past, this wish to kind of restore something that was better. And that's because, this exposure results for so many of us in a shattered and pessimistic worldview. And it's characterized by kind of a loss of meaning and purpose, loss of faith in a benign higher power, right? All of the religious institutions are struggling right now with membership, loss of the capacity for trust, arrested moral development, excessive tolerance for corruption, deceit, and betrayal, racial, ethnic, and gender-based hatred, that hopelessness, that helplessness that you were talking about, and alienation too. And it represents a departure from our innate biologically hardwired ability toward morality. The existence of mirror neurons, that tendency that we have for infants to cry when other infants cry, right? I think about when my youngest was born. My wife had a C-section and they wanted to let her rest. So they brought Murphy to the nursery. And within about 20 minutes, they brought her right back to our room. They're like, she can't be in there. She's making all the other babies cry. And that's because infants cry when they hear other infants cry. Like that, it's so innate that we are, we have empathic responses. 1-year-olds will even protest unfair treatment. And boy, do I know that in my house. And 18 months old show behaviors of altruism. So there's all this evidence that our human nature is geared towards moral and compassionate behavior. And at about 9 years old, humans are able to distinguish between accidental and intentional harms or slights. And that kind of weighs in on their determination about retaliation. So as we mature, our ability to make moral decisions that kind of determine our actions become more sophisticated. And that makes sense because we're not that fast as a species. We're not that strong as a species compared to other animals that might see us as prey. Um, and so creating familial and larger social groups helps protect us. So like attachment, morality serves an evolutionary purpose.
Yeah, really pretty profound evolutionary purpose. And I think that's what many people don't understand. It's not a matter of choice and except in going against this evolutionary drive to have a sense of really what's okay and what isn't. The idea of talking about morality seems at times to be almost passe, or if not that, then strictly the territory of religious ideologues who actually would have imposed their own preferences on the rest of us about their view of the world and their ideas about a deity. And yet, groups of people representing many different forms of diversity cannot function creatively, successfully, or peacefully without having a shared system of values that guide their conduct toward each other and their vision for what they want to accomplish and how they fit into and relate to the rest of the world.
Yeah, you and I, Sandy, have probably over 50 combined years of working with individuals who've been under stress and in treating children, adolescents, adults, and families, and even communities that have been exposed to adversity, trauma, and structural injustice. And we've learned some really important and valuable lessons from those experiences. We saw that the brain, the mind, and what I think a lot of people would refer to as the soul are not separate and distinct components of a person, but instead they're really elements of an interdependent, interactive system that as a whole describes or makes up a person.
Yeah, I have dogs, as you know, and they have rules between each other, different from ours. But all mammals have some kind of, in order to get along together. And according to theorists who have been studying the role of moral development in humans, morality binds each individual to his or her or their social group, their culture, or their moral system. And moral systems are defined as interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms that work together. Why? Why do we need them? Oh, yeah. The reason why is really important. to suppress or regulate selfishness and make coordinated social life possible.
Yeah, there have been historically two opposing ways of kind of thinking about or viewing morality. And the first is called moral absolutism, and the other is moral relativism. Moral absolutism proposes that there are these absolute laws against which all moral questions can be judged. When I think about that, I think about like the Ten Commandments, right? And based on these rules, any action that you decide to take can be considered right or wrong, regardless of the circumstances, because you're comparing it just to the absolute rule. Western ideas about morality have, for the most part, been grounded in this idea of finite and definable universal moral laws. So that means that in order for you to correctly reason morally, you would be just basing any actions that you take on these laws. And there's kind of an assumption that we can apply these laws to any or all concrete situations that we encounter in our daily lives.
Yeah, and that's not working out real well.
Not so much.
So, so moral relativism is a contrast to that. And it doesn't mean amoral. And that's really important to emphasize. Moral relativism reflects a belief that there are not, and there really cannot be any objective or universal moral truths because our lives, our world, our evolving world is so complex and changes. So instead, all moral decisions and actions have to be understood as being relative to social, cultural, historical, or personal circumstances. And although we now know that human moral development is far more complex than moral absolutism would have us believe, investigators also have come to recognize that there do seem to be very real constraints that prohibit the more extreme perspectives of moral relativism.
Hmm. I'm thinking about my social work training and what I learned about moral development. And I think that's helpful to think about too. The researcher who is most well known for doing work around moral development is Kohlberg. And he suggested that there are 6 stages. Stage 1 is about obedience and punishment, right? Very much like you do something wrong and you get punished for it. Stage 2 is individualism, instrumentalism, and exchange as sort of the best model for managing moral dilemmas. And it's sort of a I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine mentality. Uh, the third stage is really related to expectations of one's society or peers. So, kind of the messaging, implicit or explicit, that you get from other people around you. So, being a good boy, being a good girl, being a good dog, Sandy, for you, right? Um, and in this stage, individual vengeance is no longer acceptable, right? We're looking at something bigger and wider because vengeance doesn't fall into the category of being a good person. In the fourth stage, it's really about respect for laws and authority as the most important thing. And that's really where we see our criminal justice system kind of stuck at this idea that, if someone does something wrong, they have to be punished, or the terminology that we often hear is pay their debt to society. The fifth stage of moral development is moral action that's in specific situations, but is defined by universal abstract moral principles that are based on human rights and responsibilities. And in this later stage of moral development, we really see kind of the understanding that punishment doesn't really work because retribution isn't rational or sane for the larger society. also, we see in this stage of development kind of the idea that individual freedom should be limited by society only if it infringes on someone else's freedom. Um, and then the sixth stage is really where an individual develops to a point where their behavior is based on a set of universal principles that are grounded in the equality and worth of all human beings and are guided by a principled conscience.
And I assume that as a parent, you can actually see children working through these stages,
Totally.
right?
Well, it's funny because my 4-year-old has gotten to a place where he if one of the babies hits him, he will hit back no matter what. But if he makes if he accidentally knocks over his sister, he's pretty quick to say like, no, it was an accident. Like you should definitely not give me a punishment or a consequence because it was an accident. So he's starting to really understand
Yeah.
the different as it only as it like relates to him and his own actions,
Right.
he's getting there.
Right. And you can see how important that is for parents to understand that these stages change as the child develops. And so parenting has to change. So what you do has, if you want your child to get up to stage 5 and stage 6, you have to model it. Research with children in a variety of settings has demonstrated that human moral experience is really grounded in that development, which is profoundly relational. As one key author wrote, everything that psychologists know from the study of children's moral development indicates that moral identity, which is the key source of moral commitment throughout life, is fostered by multiple social influences that guide a child in the same general direction. So this is where the school system becomes really vitally important to children's, not only their cognitive development or then their emotional development, but also their moral development, because these social influences begin at birth, continue through our lives in all of the settings that we're in. And because of the lengthy and the really complex, complicated nature of human development, any relational problems at home, at school, at work can profoundly disrupt this process of healthy moral development.
Yeah, you of course now you made me start thinking about Lincoln, and I love that 4-year-old. He's so stinking cute. Um, Another example though that just came to mind as you were talking about this was he has shared with us that one of his friends calls him Linky, which he hates. I hate it too. Like it's a terrible nickname. And we asked him like, why didn't you tell him that you don't like it? And he said, I don't want to hurt his feelings. I don't want to make him feel bad. And so like we could really see that he's wrestling with this moral dilemma that's very significant to him, but also like a really clear indication about like his recognition of asserting his own needs might have a negative impact on the relationship. So, there's been a lot of focus on the capacity of people to use moral reasoning, right? And that's what Lincoln is doing. But it's also clear that conscious reasoning and reflection are often used in a negative way, right? To either justify or obfuscate dishonest behavior, moral hypocrisy, or moral inconsistency. And research has demonstrated that what we might expect to be morally irrelevant, motivational, and cognitive processes might frequently influence our moral judgments and behavior. Um, I think what that can look like is kind of accepting or aligning with the words or actions of people in authority or people we think should have our best interests at heart, even if their words or actions don't align with our own morality.
One of the things I'm always confused by is how in the world do you expect a child to develop a moral function of nonviolence if you hit the child? Just, I, it's inconceivable to me that it is okay to be violent towards children. I mean, it's always excused and rationalized, as, other than pulling a child back from running into the street. The idea of punishing children by hitting them, how can we expect children not to do the same thing in other circumstances themselves? It's just irrational. But moral reasoning alone, so that's may derail us. We need an intact emotional system to really evaluate what we are and we're not doing. And I think it's the emotions that get out of control for the parents that results in hitting the kids. I even feel it around my dogs.
Yeah.
It's tempting.
Yeah.
But our emotional system has evolved similarly to help us really evaluate and resolve the complex situations presented by our very complex social nature as a species. Emotions that are particularly relevant to the study of morality are termed moral emotions. And they include feelings like shame and guilt that make us not feel good about ourselves and what we do. They kind of are aroused if we do something that we probably shouldn't have. Righteous anger and indignation. Well, that's when we feel about what other people have done that it was really wrong and it was really not good. Pride, admiration, gratitude, and inspiration all help to guide us to appreciate the moral qualities in ourselves and in other people. And compassion and empathic distress that compel us to experience and show concern when other people are suffering, and empathic joy that connects us to really delight in other people's well-being.
Yeah, there are like three things that really have to be present for kids to have the trajectory that we're talking about for their moral development. And it's receiving empathic regard, sympathy, and attunement from their caregivers. But there's also this, concept of habits that researchers have been looking into. And it's kind of fascinating, right? So the research has examined cognitive processes associated with moral reasoning. And what they find is that what we kind of think of as these immediate moral decisions, these our intuitions or our instincts, are actually shaped by a lot of different factors, including our previous experience of reasoning through a moral dilemma. And so what that means is once a person has thought through a moral issue, subsequent responses to situations that are similar morally are likely to be rapid or automatic. So if we behave in a way that's, you know, um, we've made a moral decision about, then we're likely to do the same thing the next time a similar moral decision comes about.
Yeah, and once these habits have formed, subsequent action is not preceded by conscious reflection. It just becomes the way we do things around here. And instead, these habits of thinking and acting actually get embedded in cultural norms and in the values and codes and practices of whatever culture we're focused upon, including workplace culture. So these cultural norms make it possible for us to function somewhat automatically, and that serves to constrain our individual selfish desires, and that helps to reduce the amount of interpersonal conflict that would otherwise be present in a social situation at home, at school, at work, while driving, or out in the community, right? So as long as things are stable and we're not interacting with people who are widely divergent in their cultural norms, then those habits really serve us well. And it's really about civility and being polite and all those norms that at least used to exist.
But there's also a downside to these habits because they can become static. Like once a rule is put into place, it tends to be associated with having a moral, concrete status. And then even if we learn later that it really isn't quite right, people are still going to defend it because it's become, how we do things. And so we're not always evaluating like, how is this working or what's the outcome? Instead, we're just sort of holding fast to it as a moral standard. This really makes sense, I think, when we think about incarceration. This idea that when people violate rules, they should be punished, period. The outcomes, though, of incarceration are kind of irrelevant in that, this way of thinking, because the moral question is, you did something wrong, you should be punished. And that's really problematic.
It's not really working very well.
No.
Understanding the complexity that we're describing of morality in human experience is really vital because of what emerges out of our broadening understanding of how the human mind and the human brain actually works, particularly with a focus on what's been missing from any consideration of creating environments that actually promote health and recovery. Western ideas about morality have been thus far grounded in the idea that there are finite and definable universal moral laws, moral absolutism. Correct moral reasoning then is based on these laws, and that should permit us to apply those laws to everything, all concrete situations in daily life. But what's been observed is that there are at least three main difficulties with the moral absolutist view of the world. It means that there must be one and only one way of conceptualizing any situation. Otherwise, moral laws might contradict each other. And in moral absolutism, that's not acceptable. And then the meaning of what we're dealing with has to be unequivocal. And situations must be able to be conceptualized by a list of features that uniquely describe them and only them. Rarely, in either individual or organizational settings, are the situations we confront able to fulfill these basic requirements. We can see these conflicts between moral absolutism and moral relativism illustrated in our daily lives around situations like abortion and assisted dying, where the right to life as an absolute runs right into the right of self-determination, another absolute. And so people are in great conflict because they don't know, how do you resolve this in a universe that is actually morally relative?
So one of the things that helps us move forward in this kind of quagmire of morality is the concept of moral imagination. And we are going to talk more about that after the break. Thanks for listening to Creating Presence. We'll be back after these messages.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. We're going to continue our discussion about morality and moral safety and discuss the concept of therapeutic communities as a structure for creating moral environments.
Human beings are almost infinitely adaptable in our ability to deal with situations and circumstances that are way more confusing and complex than moral absolutism that we discussed in the last segment would really allow for. Although it's still evolving, it's human imagination that serves this adaptive function. When applied to problems that have moral implications, the use of this particular faculty has been referred to as moral imagination.
When the moral decisions that need to be made are being made not by a single person, but by a group, each of whom are adapting to change in their situations over time, the problem of a set system of rules becomes staggeringly complex. In human service delivery system, every person arrives at their workplace with their own, often poorly articulated rules about how the world works or should work. Once they arrive, they are likely to discover that the goals of the work are really unclear and that there are many theories of change that are being employed by different people at different times without any of this being systematically or even consciously understood by anybody.
Yeah, it reminds me of conversations about incarceration and the conflicting goals that shape the moral part of that conversation. You know, is locking someone up in service of improving public safety? Maybe in the short term. But then when that person suffers trauma or becomes more conditioned to respond with violence through their time in prison, what's the long-term impact on public safety? And this doesn't even really include considerations of the consequences on the incarcerated person around their own experience of dehumanization in a system that's actually supposed to offer rehabilitation, but rarely does. But anyway, more on this idea of moral imagination, right? Thought's been given by a number of contributors to the importance of moral imagination in organizational decision making and problem solving, particularly in environments where the moral stakes are really high. In organizational settings, moral imagination has been defined as a reasoning process thought to counter the organizational factors that corrupt ethical judgment. And there isn't anywhere more important than these places where human life and well-being is at stake.
Yeah, the use of moral imagination really becomes critically important when we are confronting violence. And we're confronting violence everywhere we look. As one person pointed out, transcending violence is forged by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build the immoral imagination. But using our imaginative capacities requires us to mobilize mental capacities that may not have ever been well exercised within most organizational settings. It really requires us to transcend these false dichotomies that are so typical in human discourse about who's right, who's wrong, who's good or who is bad, and instead imagine becoming fiercely curious and willing to embrace much more complex ideas. To do that requires individuals and groups to step out of our usual comfort zone into an area of uncertainty, and all uncertainty carries risk with it. So typically, in our organizational and cultural settings, especially when they're under stress, Everyone knows the landscape of violence, but are much less familiar with the landscape of nonviolence and social learning.
Yeah. So when we're sort of thinking about how do we create that, it's helpful to look at some of the researchers who studied organizational development and kind of think about what it takes to create moral imagination and understand how it functions. And there are really three things that being morally imaginative requires. So everyone in a group has to have the capacity for one, being self-reflective, knowing themselves well enough to recognize their own limitations and their role in any particular decision that's being made. Second, it requires the capacity to understand the mental models or the scripts that dominate the current situation and be willing to look at kind of underlying moral conflicts or moral disagreements that might arise in evaluating possible decisions, right? So self-awareness, awareness of the context is the second one. And then the third is that it requires a willingness to imagine new possibilities, to think individually and collectively outside of the box, and be willing to tolerate the uncertainty that inevitably comes with having, something new, not having a fixed set of behavioral routines or rules for each specific situation.
Justice, morality, faith, and belief are really at the heart of recovery from any kind of trauma. So the restoration of a sense of that there is possible a just world is a critical component of healing. Accidents and natural disasters, of course, occur quite frequently, but even in these cases, survivors have to contend with trying to make sense out of what has happened to them, whether they try to wrestle a restored sense of justice from the legal system or from what or whom they recognize as God. So the term moral injury was first used by Dr. Jonathan Shea as a descriptor for some of the really profound experiences of combat veterans. He was treating Vietnam veterans and who were defined as betrayal of what's right in a high stakes situation by someone who holds power. But the experience of moral injury occurs in any situation that a person defines as high stake.
Yeah, it's really interesting because there is something incredibly powerful about power and the abuse of power in these issues around moral injury. And people who've been intentionally hurt by others have, they contend with the abuse of power that inevitably accompanies our ability to inflict harm on others. Even if the perceived abuse of power is coming from a larger embracing system, like in war. And although it's been clear for many years that moral reasoning can be distorted by psychopathology, meaning that, if there is something wrong with us psychologically that may get in the way of our moral development, newer findings from the trauma field are actually illustrating that problems with moral reasoning might sometimes contribute to the development of psychopathology. So kind of this reversed chicken and egg dynamic. And that moral injury is a fundamental component of the experience of trauma, particularly when that trauma is a result of interpersonal violence.
And if that moral injury is accompanied by the physiological deficit secondary to early adversity in development, particularly chronic hyperarousal may influence then the perceptive, social, and cognitive abilities that push moral preferences in the present away from altruism and mutual self-interest and towards self-protective and self-interested responses. So some people have observed that the field of trauma studies hasn't adequately addressed the moral issues surrounding the main causes of traumatic experience. That's how I've ended up in public health. In the multiple efforts to offer technical solutions to the complex symptom pictures that are often the consequence of exposure to interpersonal violence, there is concern, certainly that I have had, that the causative problems, the economic, social, and political climates that are conducive to the spread of violence are not being adequately addressed, or even worse, are excused as inevitable, just part of human society, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I've termed these the traumatogenic forces that are affecting everyone and threatening all life on the planet.
Well, I think it's why, both of us have, our roots are in working with individuals and helping individual people recover from their traumatic experiences. But as we have, moved forward in our careers, both of us have really looked at how to be advocates, how to influence the social and political landscape as part of our life's work. But it also, I think, means, we've looked back at where we learned how to do that. And your experience and learning that you've shared with me about democratic therapeutic communities was really kind of how both of us started launching in this direction.
Yeah, because the whole discourse of the democratic therapeutic community, which really originated in the UK and then came over here in the 50s and 60s, was really about looking at trying to figure out how do you create new ideal mini societies in which the virtues of order and calm and productive work could replace chaos and competitiveness by creating a corrective emotional experience, as it was defined by one of the founders, Maxwell Jones. He wrote this. He said, over a period of time in a democratic therapeutic community, emotionally charged attitudes developed in childhood have to be corrected by reliving similar situations in the immediate present. One important factor in bringing about change and learning is that the provider behaves very differently in the present situation compared with the parents in the past. So in the democratic therapeutic community approach, there are some key questions. One, do we nurture the healthy, creative part of our patients, or does the system reward the sick, disturbed part? Two, do we give enough attention to the importance of people functioning meaningfully in society and the consequent importance of work and occupational therapy? Three, does the prevailing reductionist attitude to risk management fail to acknowledge that a trusting relationship is a prerequisite for therapeutic change, and that risk will ultimately be managed within therapeutic relationships?
Yeah, a couple of other key questions are, how can we encourage patients to locate responsibility in themselves when policies encourage patients and the public to see professionals as responsible? With so many medical treatments available, how do we prevent patients from becoming just passive recipients of prescription? Does the system encourage an unhelpful focus on the individual at the expense of understanding the group or institutional dynamic? And how do we prevent malignant regression, where patients develop hostile, dependent relationships with staff and tend to deteriorate when they're receiving services? So in creating presence, we have really thought a lot about these questions from democratic therapeutic communities and turn the focus not just to thinking about these in relation to the patients, as the questions suggest, but also really thinking about for the people that our agencies are serving, and similar versions of these questions in relation to staff and leadership relationships. The 20th century presented us with stunning and still unresolved moral dilemmas. And as we face the reality of global warming and species annihilation, finding ways to kind of speed up human moral development feels like an even more urgent crisis. All violence, and in addition to the physical and psychological harm that's done, represents a fundamental moral injury, a rupture in the relationship between those who are violated and their world, fractures in intergenerational development of moral integrity that can't just be healed through simple measures, and certainly not by medical intervention alone.
Yeah, it's impossible to dedicate one's life to furthering the well-being of trauma survivors without confronting something that's really hard to confront, which is the nature of evil and the profound moral questions at the heart of any culture that accepts and permits the infliction of harm upon its citizens, especially the most vulnerable. Moral injury may also, as a result, be sustained by caregivers like us who seek to offer aid to victims of trauma, but who are frustrated in their attempts to do that. And this has been called moral distress, the pain or anguish affecting the mind, body, or relationships in response to a situation in which a person is aware of a moral problem, acknowledges moral responsibility, and makes a moral judgment about the correct action, and yet, as a result of real or perceived constraints, actually participates in perceived moral wrongdoing. Moral distress occurs in situations basically where you know what the right thing to do is, but doing the right thing is thwarted by conditions under which you or your group does not have control. And this is happening everywhere, all the time, in healthcare, mental health care, and social service, because of the financial constraints that have been imposed on providers that the only thing that really matters is profitability.
Yeah, it's also clear that like elevating one moral principle over all others may lead to evil. And when we're thinking about, how do we determine the difference between good and evil? It's important to think about considering intentions, the nature of an act, the probable consequences, the actual consequences, the degree of environmental pressure on a person to act, and even their effects on the actor's further behavior. It requires a consideration of universal principles, things like sanctity of life, justice, greatest good for the greatest number.
And to complicate things even further, let's consider what happens when groups of people come together to create the next level of organization, in this case, individual businesses or programs that then network together to become systems. In creating presence, we make the assumption that all organizations of individual human beings have emergent properties that can characterize them as living systems subject to the stresses, strains, and trauma of being alive and are likely to experience trauma. And we call such traumatized systems trauma organized systems.
And they can actually make people sick, physically, psychologically, socially, and as we're talking about today, morally. And those are the kinds of systems where conflicts can't be resolved, mostly because they're denied. And leadership of those kinds of systems is likely to have some, predictable qualities. They're often strictly authoritarian, where deference and submission is given to one's place in a very rigidly enforced hierarchy or pecking order. And in those authoritarian systems, obedience and submission are the paramount goals, right? That stage one of
Right.
Kohlberg's moral development. And there's often wording that you'll hear about the need to like break somebody else's will. And instead of working through conflict, the idea is really like win-lose. But that unresolved conflict often results in actions that lead to shameful acts and layers of secrecy. Authoritarian regimes often arise as a reaction to situations where a lack of adequate leadership has led to organizational chaos, and that chaos can't be discussed. And the organizational trauma that led to the chaos also can't be discussed.
Yeah, and people caught in that kind of web of lies find that honesty is increasingly difficult to uphold as a value. There's a degradation of truth accompanied by a simultaneous embracing of both self-deceit and deceitful conduct toward others, and all kinds of crazy explanations for what's happening. An atmosphere of deceit, once established, then has to be protected. And the only way to do that is to guarantee that the members of the system are kept isolated from accurate information that could unveil the deceit. So control over behavior and the flow of information then can only be exercised through using power abusively and coercively. And so actual threats or acts of violence are simply the extreme example along a continuum of that kind of coercion.
Let's talk about moral viruses, right? So when these kinds of situations occur, moral misalignment is likely between staff and management, and all staff and the overtly stated organizational values and mission, right? That there's just like a complete disconnect. And the organization then becomes infected by a moral virus, disabling and inaccurate negative beliefs that conflict with universal principles, but that are often hidden deep in the organization's operating system. That's what we're referring to as moral viruses. And in creating presence, we've come to believe that one of the major causes of vicarious trauma, burnout, and failure of the helpers to actually help the people that they're supposed to be caring for comes about because of that systemic infection of these moral viruses that lead to empathic failure and lack of a moral imagination.
If we view the organizational operating system for mental health and social services through that kind of a lens, we may see that the process of care often begins with diagnostic labeling that really can be experienced by the person as dehumanizing. Label theory and labeling as a source of potential harm goes back to the 1960s, and today really is largely ignored.
So we're also talking about this idea of parallel process. And, it really comes from that work in democratic therapeutic communities. And when we move from one level of the organization to another, we're looking at problems that are characterized by ever greater complexity, but we're focusing on individual recovery from traumatic experiences in the service that we're providing. And so looking at all of these different layers feels really daunting. If we change the way that we're thinking, shifting our mental models, and shifting our paradigm for how we think about care, how we think about recovery, we and then sort of use a moral lens, then what we're going to see is that totalitarian systems of structure in our organizations are completely undermining our larger goals.
And maybe getting to the root of the problems that face us everywhere may not be as impossible as it seems. In presence, we assume that there really is validity to this notion that Sarah was just referring to of parallel process, defined as that which occurs when two or more systems, whether they are individuals, groups, or organizations, have significant relationships with one another, they tend to develop similar thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Yeah, and although usually parallel process is a way of understanding what appear to be puzzling layers of conflict within an organization, empirically, we've seen that it's possible to deliberately create that parallel process of recovery if we are able to apply the correct moral climate, if we can create that in our systems. And if it's true, and you and I both know that it is, then creating a paradigm shift at one level of the organization can have a relevance to every other level. And so that sort of reinforces that notion of act local, think global, as applicable to our creating presence organizations. Thanks so much for listening to season 3 of Creating Presence. We hope you'll join us for our upcoming episodes when we are back with season 4. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. Thanks so much.